In January of 1854, a midwife in Henry County, Virginia, delivered a baby boy who would become the center of a scandal that destroyed one of the state's wealthiest families. The child appeared healthy, strong lungs, good weight, dark hair. But when the doctor examined the infant's hands, he froze. The right hand bore 6 fully formed fingers, each with its own nail and knuckle working perfectly. The 3 men waiting outside the birthing room, all claiming to be the father, stared at that extra digit as if it were a death sentence. And in many ways, it was, because that baby was born to a woman with skin white as bone and eyes pale as dawn. A woman who'd been purchased at a New Orleans slave auction for $4,000 and forced to become wife to 3 brothers simultaneously. The 6-fingered child was supposed to secure their inheritance. Instead, it revealed a conspiracy of greed, fraud, and desperation that had been poisoning the Rutledge family for years. Before we uncover how an albino woman became trapped in an arrangement so bizarre that Virginia society tried to bury all records of it, and why her 6-fingered son became the key to unraveling everything, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, and down in the comments, tell me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where all of you dark mystery lovers are hiding. Now, let's go back to the spring of 1852 when 3 brothers made a decision that would doom them all. The Rutledge plantation sprawled across 800 acres of prime Virginia soil just outside Richmond in Henry County. Tobacco had made the family wealthy. 3 generations of careful cultivation, shrewd trading, and calculated marriages into prominent families. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming in summer heat, surrounded by oak trees older than the nation itself. Samuel Rutledge was 34 when his father died that spring of 1852. As the eldest, he'd always carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who knew his place in the world. His jaw was square, his eyes the color of tobacco leaves just before harvest. He wore responsibility like tailored coats, perfectly fitted and never loosened. Thomas, at 31, was softer around the edges. He handled the plantation's finances, spent evenings bent over ledges in the estate office. Where Samuel commanded, Thomas suggested. Where Samuel stood firm, Thomas negotiated. His hair had begun to thin at the crown, and he'd developed a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when anxious. William, the youngest at 28, had been meant for the church. He'd spent 2 years at seminary in Philadelphia before their mother's death brought him home. He still quoted scripture at dinner, still kept a Bible on his bedside table, but something in his eyes suggested his faith had developed cracks he tried not to examine. He was tallest of the 3, with hands better suited to holding books than managing field workers. Their father's death on April 3rd changed something fundamental between them. Josiah Rutledge had collapsed in the tobacco fields during an inspection, his heart simply stopping mid-sentence. He was 61 years old, and he died without saying goodbye. 3 days after they buried Josiah in the family plot, the brothers gathered for the reading of the will. Chester Hafford, the family's attorney for 12 years, sat behind the massive mahogany desk. He was 58, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that caught lamplight. He had the careful manner of a man who dealt in other people's secrets. The study smelled of old tobacco and leather. Samuel, Thomas, and William arranged themselves in chairs facing the desk, 3 men waiting to learn their futures. The first sections were standard, the plantation divided equally, assets shared in common, the workforce to remain together. Then Hafford reached the 7th clause, and his voice changed. My sons shall inherit all properties, monies, and assets on the condition that they preserve the purity of the Rutledge bloodline through a union that maintains our family's distinction and prevents the dilution of our heritage through common marriage. This union must be singular in nature, bound by law, yet unusual in practice, and must produce an heir within 3 years of my passing. Should this condition not be met, all assets shall be liquidated and donated to the Virginia Agricultural Society, and my sons shall receive only $300 per annum each. Silence filled the study. Samuel leaned forward. Read that again. Hafford did, word for word. What the hell does that mean? Thomas's voice cracked. Singular in nature, but unusual in practice. William had gone pale. It means Father wanted us to share an inheritance without dividing it. One union among 3 brothers. That's impossible, Samuel said flatly. A woman can't marry 3 men. It's not impossible, Hafford interrupted gently. Legally, 1 brother marries. Socially, the arrangement is flexible. Your father feared that dividing the plantation would destroy what he'd built. He wanted the estate to remain whole, managed by all 3 of you, bound by more than blood. You're saying he wanted us to share a wife. Thomas gripped his chair arms until knuckles went white. I'm saying your father wanted to ensure you worked together, that you couldn't divide the property and go separate ways. This was his solution. Samuel walked to the window. And if we refuse, then everything becomes a footnote in Virginia agricultural history. The land sold, the house belonging to strangers, the workers scattered. Havford cleaned his spectacles. Your father believed you'd find a way. William's voice was barely audible. This is madness. This is inheritance, Havford replied. You have 3 years to comply, or you lose everything. They sat until sunset filled the room with shadows. They discussed and argued, voices rising and falling. Samuel insisted it was impossible. Thomas calculated what they'd lose. William quoted scripture about marriage sanctity. But they all knew their decision. The plantation was worth $47,000. $300 yearly would barely support one brother, let alone 3. They had no choice. Over following weeks, Havford worked with Samuel to craft a plan. It would require discretion, careful timing, and a woman who had no choice but to comply. A woman who couldn't protest or refuse. A woman whose very existence would be controlled entirely by the 3 brothers. That's when Havford mentioned the upcoming auction in New Orleans and the unusual merchandise that would be available there. The journey to New Orleans took 6 days. Samuel, Thomas, and William traveled by rail and steamboat, watching Virginia's green hills give way to Louisiana's flat, humid expanse. They didn't speak much. Each brother retreated into his own justifications for what they were about to do. New Orleans in late August was a cauldron of heat and humanity. The auction house stood on Charter Street, a 2-story building with iron balconies. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and desperation, of transactions that stripped away everything except commercial value. Havford had sent word ahead. He'd learned which auction houses dealt in the unusual, the rare, the merchandise that fetched premium prices from wealthy men looking for exotic curiosities. The brothers arrived an hour early. The holding area was divided by wooden partitions. Most potential purchases were field workers, strong backs, and calloused hands. But in the far corner, separated by cloth partition, stood something that made all 3 brothers stop walking. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her skin was white, not pale, but white as milk, white as bone. Her hair fell in waves past her shoulders, colorless as spider silk. Her eyes, when she lifted them briefly, were the faintest pink, like the inside of certain shells. She wore a simple gray dress, too large for her thin frame. Her wrists bore marks of recently removed shackles, red lines against that impossible white skin. She stood perfectly still, as if she'd learned that movement brought attention, and attention brought pain. Gentlemen, this is quite a rare offering. The auctioneer appeared beside them, a portly man named Duchamp with sweat-stained linen. Pure albino. Been in 3 different households since birth. Current owner settling debts. Needs quick sale. She's healthy, capable of housework. Speaks decent English. But I'll tell you straight, she's delicate. Can't be in direct sun long, eyes sensitive to bright light. You're not buying field labor. Samuel circled her slowly the way he might examine a horse. She didn't look at him, kept her gaze on the floor. Where's she from originally? Born on a plantation in South Carolina. Mother died in childbirth. Father unknown. The condition passes through families. Sometimes shows up unexpected. She's been taught domestic skills. Sewing, cleaning, basic cooking. Thomas stepped closer. Has she borne children? No, sir. Intact. Far as medical examination showed, Duchamp lowered his voice. Between us gentlemen, she'd make quite a conversation piece in the right household. Imagine the talk at dinner parties. William remained several feet back, jaw clenched. But Samuel and Thomas exchanged a look that needed no words. This was exactly what they needed. Someone unusual enough to justify their father's strange clause. Someone legally powerless to refuse whatever arrangement they proposed. Someone whose very appearance would make the peculiar circumstance seem almost logical, a necessary measure to prevent such unusual traits from spreading beyond control. "What's your name?" Samuel asked her directly. She hesitated, then spoke so quietly they had to lean in. "Clara, sir." Her voice carried no accent they could identify. It was as if she'd been trained to exist without origin, without history. "Clara," Samuel repeated. "Do you understand what happens at these auctions?" "Yes, sir." "These auctions? Do you have any family? Anyone who would look for you?" "No, sir." Samuel nodded. A blank slate. A person so thoroughly erased that she could be reshaped into whatever the brothers needed. The auction began at 2 o'clock. When Clara Ara was brought to the block, the room fell into unusual hush. Even men accustomed to buying human beings stared with open curiosity. Bidding started at $1,000. Samuel raised his card immediately. A Mississippi planter jumped to $1,500. Thomas raised to $2,000. Back and forth it went, price climbing as men decided whether they wanted this unusual prize. At $3,000, most bidders dropped out. At $3,500, only 2 remained. The Rutledge brothers and a sugar baron from Baton Rouge. Samuel stood, making sure everyone could see his face. $4,000. The room went silent. It was an obscene amount. The sugar baron hesitated, then shook his head and sat down. Sold. Duchamp's gavel came down to the Virginia gentleman for $4,000. That's how Clara Ara became property of the Rutledge brothers. Papers were signed, money exchanged, and she was led into brutal August sunlight that made her squint and shield her eyes. They traveled back to Virginia with their purchase. Clara Ara sat in the rail car, staring out the window, never speaking unless spoken to. The brothers discussed their plan in low voices in the smoking car. Samuel would legally marry her as eldest and most socially prominent, but the arrangement would be explained clearly. She would live with all 3 brothers, would be expected to fulfill wheelie duties to all 3, would produce an heir that would belong to the Rutledge family regardless of biological paternity. It's biblical, William said, suddenly defensive. Jacob had 2 wives. Abraham had Sarah and Hagar. King David had multiple wives. If we're preserving a family line, God will understand. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. It's not biblical marriage we're discussing. It's legal convenience wrapped in Old Testament precedent. Then what is it about? William demanded. Samuel answered quietly, watching tobacco fields roll past. Survival. It's about keeping what's ours. Father understood that. The law understands that. And she'll understand it too. Or she'll learn to. They arrived at the plantation on September 2nd. The house staff had been told to prepare the guest bedroom in the west wing, the one with windows facing the garden, curtains that could block bright sunlight. Clara Ara was taken there immediately, given water and food, left alone to acclimate. That evening, all 3 brothers gathered in her room. Samuel did most of the talking, his voice even and businesslike. Clara, you're here to fulfill a specific purpose. You're going to marry me in a legal ceremony, but you need to understand that you belong to all 3 of us. You'll live in this house. You'll be provided for. You'll want for nothing material, but you'll be expected to be a wife to all 3 brothers. Do you understand what I'm saying? She sat on the bed's edge, hands folded in her lap, and nodded once. You'll address each of us as husband when we're in private. In public, you'll be Mrs. Samuel Rutledge, but you'll show equal respect to Thomas and William. You'll share your time equally among us, your affections equally, your body equally. Is this clear? Another nod. Thomas stepped forward. If you try to run, you'll be caught and punished. If you tell anyone about our arrangement, you'll be punished. If you fail to conceive a child within reasonable time, we'll find other arrangements. But if you cooperate, you'll live comfortably, better than you would have anywhere else. William said nothing, just stood near the door, face unreadable in lamplight. Clara finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. When is the wedding? 2 weeks, Samuel replied. Small ceremony at the Presbyterian Church in Richmond, just family and a few close associates. You'll wear white. You'll smile. You'll say the vows. And then you'll come back here and begin your duties. She looked up at him then, and for just a moment something flickered in those pale pink eyes. Fear or fury or resignation, the brothers couldn't tell. Then it was gone, replaced by blank acceptance. Yes, sir, she said. The brothers left her alone. As they walked down the hallway, William finally broke his silence. God forgive us, he whispered. Samuel's response was cold as winter. God or not, we're doing this. We've come too far to turn back now. The wedding took place on September 16th at Richmond's Second Presbyterian Church. Small affair, just 20 guests, mostly business associates and distant cousins, useful for maintaining social standing. Hafford attended, standing near the back, watching his careful plan unfold. Clara Ara wore white dress that one of the house slaves had altered to fit. Her hair was pinned up, covered by lace veil that softened the startling whiteness of her skin. In the church's dim interior, she looked almost ghostly. Reverend Marcus Pennington performed the ceremony. He was 64, had married and buried 3 generations of Virginia families. He noticed that the bride never looked at the groom, that she spoke her vows in a monotone, suggesting neither joy nor sorrow, just compliance. He noticed 2 other young men stood unusually close to the groom, and that their expressions were identical. Relief mixed with something darker. At the reception held at the plantation afterward, Clara Ara sat silently, while guests congratulated Samuel while men clapped his back and women whispered about the peculiar bride. Someone asked where Samuel had found such an exotic wife, and he smiled and said only that she came from excellent Carolina stock, that her unique appearance would ensure their children would be remembered. By 10 o'clock, guests had departed. The brothers and Clara Ara were alone in the house, servants dismissed to their quarters. The 4 of them stood in the main hallway, and the weight of what came next hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Samuel spoke first. "Clara Ara, we'll start tonight. You'll come to my room. Tomorrow night, Thomas's room. The night after, William's. We'll rotate like that. Keep it simple and fair. Do you understand?" She nodded. That same mechanical acceptance. Any questions? She looked at each of them in turn, studying their faces as if memorizing features for some future accounting. Then she asked the only question that seemed to matter. "And after I have a child, what happens then?" The brothers exchanged glances. Samuel answered carefully, "Then you'll have fulfilled your primary duty. The rest we'll determine as we go." It wasn't really an answer, and Clara Ara knew it, but she didn't press. She simply followed Samuel up the stairs to his bedroom, her white dress trailing behind her like a shroud. The arrangement continued for months. Clara Ara rotated between the 3 brothers' bedrooms like cargo being redistributed to maintain balance. During the day, she was Mrs. Samuel Rutledge, managing the household, supervising house staff, appearing at her husband's side when business associates visited. She learned to smile at appropriate moments, to make small talk about weather and gardens, to exist as the wife of a prominent Virginia gentleman, but at night she belonged equally to 3 men who had purchased her like a prize mare and expected her to produce their salvation in the form of an heir. The brothers maintained their routine for 8 months. Samuel was businesslike about the arrangement, treating their private hours like an obligation to be fulfilled efficiently. Thomas was gentler, sometimes apologetic, occasionally trying to make conversation as if that would make the situation less grotesque. William always quoted scripture before and after, as if he could sanctify what they were doing through sheer volume of biblical reference. Then in May of 1853, Clara Ara missed her monthly courses. By June, the house physician confirmed what everyone suspected: she was pregnant. The brothers celebrated with expensive bourbon in the study, toasting their success, their father's wisdom, their secured inheritance. Havford was summoned and informed that the first requirement of the will had been met. He made careful notes in his leather journal and assured them that as long as Clara Ara delivered a healthy child, their inheritance was secure. Clara Ara herself said nothing when told about the pregnancy. She simply nodded and continued her daily routine, one hand occasionally drifting to her still flat stomach as if she couldn't quite believe something was growing there. The pregnancy progressed normally through summer and into fall. Clara Ara grew rounder, moved more carefully, spent long hours in the garden where she could sit in shade and watch butterflies move between flowers. The brothers became solicitous of her health, ensuring she had the best food, the softest chairs, whatever comfort could be provided. But beneath the surface of domestic tranquility, something was shifting. Clara Ara had begun to change in subtle ways. She asked more questions about the plantation's finances. She requested books from Thomas's library and read them in the evening by lamplight. She learned the names of all 37 enslaved people on the property, something none of the brothers had bothered to do. She watched and listened, and behind those pale pink eyes, calculations were being made. On January 9th, 1854, after 14 hours of labor attended by the physician who confirmed the pregnancy, Clara Ara gave birth to a son. The child was healthy with a full head of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival with impressive volume. The doctor cleaned the baby, wrapped him in soft cloth, and prepared to hand him to the exhausted mother. Then he noticed the hands. The baby had 6 fingers on his right hand, a fully formed, functional 6th digit growing from the side of his palm, complete with nail and knuckle. The doctor froze, staring at this unexpected development, He looked at Clara Ara, whose face had gone even paler than usual, then at the three brothers who had crowded into the birthing room. Samuel reached the baby first. He pulled back the cloth, examined the tiny hand, counted the fingers twice, as if the sixth might disappear if he concentrated hard enough. "What is this?" His voice was dangerously quiet. The doctor cleared his throat nervously. "It's called polyactyl, sir. Extra digits. It's not terribly uncommon. Appears in perhaps 1 in every 1,000 births. It can run in families or appear spontaneously. The finger appears fully formed, fully functional. It's not a deformity in the sense of being harmful." "It's a mark," William interrupted, face gone white. "A mark of sin, of impure blood, of—" "It's a genetic variation," the doctor said firmly. "Nothing more. Many perfectly healthy people live with extra fingers. It can be surgically removed if you prefer, though there's no medical reason." "Get out." Samuel's words cut like a knife. "Leave the child. Get out of this room." The doctor handed the baby to Clara Ara, gathered his instruments, and left quickly. The three brothers stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the infant nursing at his mother's breast, at that extra finger that seemed to mock everything they'd planned. Thomas spoke first, voice shaking. "Which of us do you think? Does it matter?" Samuel's tone was bitter. "The child is marked and strange, just like her." Clara Ara looked up from the baby, and for the first time since arriving at the plantation, she spoke without being spoken to first. Her voice was calm, almost cold. "He's your heir. Your father's requirement was an heir within 3 years. Here he is. You got what you wanted." "We wanted a perfect heir," Samuel shot back. "Not something that will make people talk, that will raise questions about purity." Clara's laugh was sharp and humorless about bloodlines, about preserving family distinction. "Look at what your father's obsession created. Look at what you three created. You wanted something unusual, and unusual is what you got." The brothers had no response. They filed out one by one, leaving Clara alone with the six-fingered baby who would either secure or destroy their inheritance. For 3 days, the brothers argued behind closed doors. William insisted the child's condition was a sign of God's displeasure. Thomas calculated probabilities, trying to determine which of them might carry genetic predisposition to polyactyli. Samuel focused on practical concerns, whether the child's condition would affect the inheritance, whether they could keep it secret, whether surgical removal would be safe. On the 4th day, Havford arrived in response to an urgent message. He examined the baby thoroughly, made notes, then delivered his verdict. "Your father's will specifies an heir. It doesn't specify a perfect heir. This child satisfies the legal requirement." However, he paused, choosing words carefully. "The unusual nature of his condition may raise questions about paternity, about bloodlines, about whether the Rutledge family genetics are as pure as your father believed. Such questions could complicate future business dealings, social standing, marriage prospects for the child." "So, what do we do?" Samuel demanded. "You do nothing." Ford closed his journal. "You register the birth. You name the child. You present him as your son and heir. If anyone asks about the finger, you say it's a harmless variation that runs in Carolina families, something inherited from the mother's side. You make it sound common, unimportant, and you pray that no one looks too closely at any other aspect of your domestic arrangement." They named the baby Josiah after his grandfather. The extra finger remained. The doctor advised against surgery on an infant so young, and secretly, each brother feared that removing it might somehow invalidate the inheritance. Clara Ara recovered from the birth slowly. She moved through the house like a ghost, the baby always in her arms or nearby in his cradle. She'd stopped rotating between the brothers' bedrooms. There was no longer any reason for that particular arrangement, and none of them pushed the issue. She took up residence in the nursery, sleeping in a small bed near the baby's cradle, effectively separating herself from the brothers while remaining under their roof. The months following the birth were marked by strange, tense peace. The plantation continued its operations. Tobacco was planted and harvested, the baby grew stronger, and the brothers tried to pretend everything was normal. But Clara Ara was changing. The blank acceptance that had characterized her first year was gone. She'd begun to assert small rebellions, refusing certain social functions, insisting on making decisions about the baby's care without consulting the brothers, spending hours in Thomas's library reading law books and historical texts. And she'd started asking questions. questions about the plantation's finances, questions about her legal status as Samuel's wife, questions about what would happen to her and the baby if anything happened to the brothers. Thomas, who still handled the estate's books, tried to deflect her inquiries, but Clara Ara was persistent, and she'd learned that patience was a weapon that could be wielded with devastating effect. What none of the brothers knew was that Clara Ara had also begun corresponding with someone. Letters arrived at the plantation addressed to Mrs. Samuel Rutledge. Letters that Clara Ara collected from house staff before anyone else could see them. She read these letters in privacy, then burned them in the nursery fireplace, watching papers curl and blacken as if erasing evidence of a crime not yet committed. The author of these letters was Josiah Rutledge's brother, Martin Rutledge, who had been conspicuously absent from the wedding and all subsequent family gatherings. Martin had his own plantation in North Carolina, his own fortune built on tobacco and cotton, and Martin had his own opinions about his brother's bizarre will, opinions he'd kept carefully quiet until now. In October of 1854, 1 year and 8 months after Clara had become part of the Rutledge household, a visitor arrived at the plantation. He came on horseback, well-dressed with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He asked to speak with Samuel Rutledge on urgent family business. The visitor was Martin Rutledge's attorney, a man named Silas Corbett, and he carried documents that would unravel everything the brothers thought they'd secured. But that revelation was still weeks away. For now, Corbett simply introduced himself, accepted refreshment, and mentioned casually that he'd be staying in Richmond for a few days, attending to business matters. Samuel showed him every courtesy, never suspecting that his uncle had just made the first move in a game far more complex than three brothers trying to satisfy their father's will. Never suspecting that Clara Ara had been laying groundwork for this moment since the day she'd given birth to a six-fingered baby, and realized that her unusual child might be either her chain or her key to freedom. The evening after Corbett's visit, Clara stood at her window overlooking the tobacco fields, the baby sleeping peacefully in his cradle behind her. She touched the glass with one pale finger, leaving a small mark in the condensation. Through the smudged spot, she could see lights in the overseer's cottage, in the curing barns, in the distant slave quarters. So many lives intertwined on this land, all controlled by three men who thought they'd secured their future by purchasing a white-skinned girl at a New Orleans auction. Clara smiled then, a small, cold smile that held no joy and whispered something too quiet for anyone to hear. But if the words could have been captured, they might have been, "Let's see how pure your bloodline really is, gentlemen." Silas Corbett returned to the Rutledge plantation on October 23rd. This time he came with more than pleasantries. He arrived with a leather portfolio containing documents that Samuel, Thomas, and William would find deeply troubling. The brothers met him in Josiah's old study. Corbett spread papers across the desk with deliberate care of a man building a case in court. "Gentlemen, I'll be direct because my client, Martin Rutledge, values directness. There are significant irregularities in your father's will. My client has reason to believe that certain provisions may have been altered or added after the original document was executed." Samuel went very still. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Corbett. Our father's will was properly witnessed, properly filed." "By Chester Hafford, yes, but were you aware that Hafford and Martin Rutledge had a falling out 3 years before Josiah's death over a business deal gone bad? Were you aware that Hafford lost nearly $7,000 in a cotton speculation that Martin refused to back? Were you aware that your father's signature on certain pages of the will doesn't quite match his signature on other legal documents from the same period?" Thomas's hand went to the back of his neck, rubbing. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Martin Rutledge has questions about the validity of certain testamentary provisions, particularly the unusual clause regarding marriage and heirs. Martin believes that clause was inserted by Hafford after Josiah's death as a means of controlling you three and, more importantly, controlling the flow of money from the estate." William leaned forward. "Controlling money? How?" Corbett pulled out another document. "This is a ledger from Hafford's law office obtained through certain channels. I won't specify. It shows regular payments from the Rutledge estate to Hafford's accounts. Payments well above his normal legal fees. Payments labeled as estate management and inheritance administration. Over the past 18 months, he's withdrawn nearly $11,000. The number hung in the air. Samuel's jaw clenched. "Thomas, is that accurate?" Thomas had gone pale. There have been payments to Hafford for managing the legal complexities of the inheritance, for filing paperwork for $11,000 in 18 months. Samuel's voice rose. For paperwork? Corbett continued, tone measured and professional. Martin Rutledge believes that Chester Hafford orchestrated this entire situation, that he inserted the marriage clause knowing you'd be desperate to comply, knowing it would require his ongoing legal management, knowing he could slowly drain the estate while keeping you focused on satisfying an impossible condition, and he may not have been working alone. What do you mean? William's voice was barely audible. I mean that Martin Rutledge has been investigating your father's final months. Josiah was in excellent health, according to his physician in Richmond. Then suddenly in March of 1852, he began complaining of fatigue, irregular heartbeat, dizzy spells. He died 5 weeks later. The physician attributed it to natural decline, heart failure brought on by age. But Martin has spoken with household staff from that period. Several mentioned that Josiah's meals were often delivered to him in his study by Chester Hafford, who visited frequently during those final weeks. The implication was clear. Samuel stood abruptly, chair scraping against floor. You're accusing Hafford of murder, of poisoning our father. I'm saying there are questions that deserve answers. Martin is prepared to challenge the will in court. But before he does, he wanted to extend an offer to you three. Work with him to investigate Hafford, help expose whatever scheme is operating here, and Martin will ensure the plantation remains in family hands, properly divided among all 4 nephews. Refuse, and Martin files his challenge tomorrow. Either way, the truth comes out. Samuel paced to the window. Behind him, Thomas was frantically calculating numbers in his head. William had his head in his hands, probably praying for guidance that wouldn't come. We need time, Samuel finally said. Time to review our records, too. You have 3 days, Corbett interrupted. Martin is not a patient man, and the longer this continues, the more money disappears. 3 days, gentlemen. Then I need your answer. After Corbett left, the brothers remained in the study for hours. They pulled every ledger Thomas kept, every record of transactions with Hafford. The pattern became clear quickly. Hafford had been systematically overcharging for services, creating fictional legal expenses, billing for work never performed. But the payments had been small enough, spread out enough that Thomas had never questioned them individually. Only when seen together did they reveal the scope of theft. He played us, Thomas said, voice hollow. From the moment Father died, he played us. Samuel slammed his hand on the desk. The will. We need to examine the will itself, get the original from the courthouse. But there was a problem. The original will was held in Hafford's office safe, as was customary for estate documents still under active administration. The courthouse only had a certified copy, a copy that Hafford himself had filed. We could break into his office, William suggested, then looked shocked at his own words. I mean, if we need the original, we need Clara, Samuel said abruptly. Both brothers stared at him. Think about it. Corbett knows things about the household that he shouldn't know. Things about Father's final months, about meals delivered, about Hafford's visits. How would Martin know any of that? He wasn't here, but Clara Ara was. Clara Ara has been here for 2 years watching everything, listening to the servants gossip, asking questions. You think she's been feeding information to Martin? Thomas interrupted. I think she's smarter than we gave her credit for, and I think she's been looking for a way out since the day we brought her here. They found Clara in the nursery as always. Little Josiah was 14 months old now, beginning to walk, babbling sounds that might someday be words. He was beautiful despite, or perhaps because of, his unusual hand. Clara Ara had refused to let anyone suggest removing the extra finger, had defended it fiercely any time the subject arose. The 3 brothers entered without knocking. Clara Ara looked up from where she sat, reading to the baby, expression carefully neutral. Samuel spoke first. We had a visitor today, Silas Corbett. He works for my Uncle Martin. He knows things about this household that he shouldn't know. So, I'll ask you directly. Have you been corresponding with Martin Rutledge? Clara Ara sat down the book carefully. I've been corresponding with several people. I'm a married woman. I'm permitted to send and receive letters. Don't play games, Samuel warned. Have you been giving information to Martin? I've been seeking legal advice, as is my right given my unusual situation. Thomas stepped forward. Clara, if you're helping Martin challenge the will, you're destroying your own security. If the inheritance is divided among 4 people instead of 3, there's less for everyone, including you and the baby. Clara Ara smiled then, and it wasn't the blank, compliant expression they'd grown used to. It was sharp and knowing. You really don't understand, do you? I have no security. I never did. I'm property that you dressed up in a wedding gown. I have no legal standing, no rights, no claim to anything except what you three choose to give me. And if you all died tomorrow, I'd be right back where I started, auctioned off to whoever wanted to pay. The baby would be taken away, raised by strangers, and I'd have nothing. You think I care about your inheritance problems? You think I want to preserve what you built here?" The truth of her words hit them like cold water. They'd never considered what would happen to Clara if their arrangement fell apart. William found his voice. "What did you tell Martin?" "I told him the truth. That your father was healthy until he suddenly wasn't. That Chester Havford visited constantly in those final weeks. That Havford has been taking money from the estate. That you three have been so focused on satisfying a bizarre will provision that you never stopped to ask if that provision was legitimate. I told him everything because Martin promised me something none of you ever did. My freedom and my son's future." Samuel's face had gone dark red. "You betrayed us." "Betrayed you?" Clarara's laugh was bitter. "You bought me. You forced me to share a bed with 3 different men. You impregnated me and then were disappointed that the baby wasn't perfect enough. And you call it betrayal when I try to find a way out. I call it survival. I call it—" The room fell silent, except for little Josiah making quiet noises as he played with wooden blocks. The extra finger on his right hand worked just as well as the other 5, grasping and releasing with the unconcern of a child who didn't yet know he was different. Thomas spoke quietly. "What did Martin promise you exactly? If the will is overturned, if Havford is exposed, Martin will give me $3,000 in legal documents granting me and Josiah freedom. We can go anywhere, start over, live as free people. All I had to do was tell the truth about what I've observed here." $3,000, Samuel repeated. "That's less than we paid for you, but it's mine. Mine and my son's. Not dependent on satisfying your father's conditions or maintaining your family's precious bloodline. It's freedom, Samuel. Something you've never had to think about because you were born with it." Before Samuel could respond, there was a knock at the nursery door. One of the house servants, an older woman named Ruth, who'd been with the family for 30 years, entered hesitantly, begging, "Pardon, Mr. Samuel, but there's something you need to see in the master study. Right away, sir." The brothers followed Ruth downstairs, leaving Clara alone with the baby. When they entered the study, they found Chester Havford standing by the desk, his face ashen. "How did you get in here?" Samuel demanded. "I still have keys to this house. I helped your father build this estate. I drafted his will. I've managed his affairs for 12 years, and now I'm here to tell you that you need to stop Martin's investigation immediately." "Why would we do that?" Thomas asked coldly. "You've been stealing from us." Havford's composure cracked. "I haven't been stealing. I've been surviving. You think your father left you a fortune? He left you a shell, a beautiful, impressive shell with almost nothing inside." The 3 brothers froze. Havford continued, words tumbling out in a rush. "Your father was a gambler, gentlemen. Not in the social sense, not cards at parties. He gambled on cotton futures, on rail speculation, on every risky investment that came along. He lost money for years, and he covered it by taking loans against the plantation. By the time he died, this estate was mortgaged to 3 different banks. The tobacco crops barely covered interest payments. The fortune you think you inherited, it never existed. Not anymore." Samuel's voice was dangerous. "You're lying. I have the loan documents. I have the bank statements. I've been working for 2 years to keep this estate afloat, to make payments, to juggle creditors. Those excessive fees I've been charging, that money went to banks to keep them from foreclosing. I've been saving your inheritance, not stealing it." Thomas collapsed into a chair. "How much do we owe?" $37,000, give or take. Nearly the entire value of the property." William looked like he might vomit. "That's impossible." Father was careful. He was desperate. Havford interrupted. "After your mother died, he became convinced he was going to lose everything. He took bigger risks, chased bigger returns, and lost bigger sums. That clause in the will about preserving the bloodline wasn't about family unity. It was about making sure you 3 stayed together, pooled your resources, worked as one unit to pay off his debts. He knew that if you divided the property, if you went your separate ways, the banks would foreclose and the Rutland name would be destroyed." The study was silent. Outside, autumn sun was setting, painting tobacco fields in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and bankrupt. Samuel finally spoke. "Does Martin know about the debt?" "Not yet, but he will, the moment he subpoenas bank records. And when he does, he'll realize that challenging the will means getting a share of a massive debt, not a fortune. He'll walk away, and the banks will move in, and everything your family built over 4 generations will be auctioned off to pay creditors. So, what do we do? William's voice was barely a whisper. Havford straightened slightly. We do what your father intended. We work together, all of us, to save what can be saved. I continue managing the estate, making payments, negotiating with banks. You 3 keep the plantation running, keep producing crops, keep generating income, and Clara needs to be convinced that her best interest lies in maintaining the status quo. She wants freedom, Thomas said. Then we give her a reason to stay. We draw up papers, real papers, legal papers that grant her and the child certain protections, a trust fund for the boy, a guarantee that if anything happens to you 3, she receives a percentage of whatever's left. Make her a partner in survival instead of an enemy. The door opened suddenly. Clara Ara stood there, little Josiah balanced on her hip. She must have been listening from the hallway because her expression showed she'd heard everything. So the great Rutledge fortune is a lie, she said quietly. The inheritance you bought me to secure doesn't even exist. Havford turned to face her. Mrs. Rutledge, the situation is more complicated. Don't. Clara Ara cut him off. Don't try to spin this. You all used me. All of you. Josiah used his sons. The sons used me. You used everyone. And now you want me to stay silent and compliant so this house of cards doesn't collapse. I want you to make a rational choice, Havford replied. If Martin's challenge succeeds, you get $3,000 in freedom, but no home, no security beyond that single payment, and a child who will grow up knowing his father's family was destroyed by scandal and debt. If the estate survives, I'll ensure you and Josiah have legal protections, income, a future. It's not freedom, but it's survival. Clara looked at each of them in turn. Then she looked at her son, at his bright eyes and his 6-fingered hand, and something in her expression shifted. I want papers drawn up by tomorrow. Papers that put a trust fund of $5,000 in Josiah's name, untouchable by any of you. Papers that give me legal ownership of the west wing of this house. Papers that specify if any of you 3 dies, I receive 1/3 of whatever estate remains. And I want Chester Havford removed as estate manager. Thomas takes over all financial decisions with oversight from an independent attorney I select. Havford opened his mouth to protest, but Samuel raised a hand. Done all of it. Clara Ara studied him. And you'll stop the rotation arrangement. I'm not sharing bedrooms with any of you anymore. That part of this farce is over. Agreed. Then I'll tell Martin to withdraw his challenge. I'll write him personally and explain that the family has resolved its differences. But know this. If any of you breaks these terms, if you try to cheat me or my son out of what's been promised, I will burn this plantation to the ground before I let you profit from it. Are we clear? The 3 brothers nodded. They had no choice. Clara Ara held all the leverage now. After she left, Havford sagged against the desk. I never meant for it to go this far. While profiting handsomely, Samuel noted, while earning fair compensation for work no one else wanted to do, but yes, I profited. We all did what we had to do to survive, including her. The tobacco crop of 1855 started with promise. Good rains in early spring, warm days that brought the plants up strong. By May, the fields were a sea of broad green leaves, and for the first time in months, the brothers allowed themselves to hope. Then the weather turned. June brought heat unlike anything the region had seen in years. Temperatures climbed into the high 90s day after day. The tobacco plants wilted despite watering, their leaves curling at the edges. When rains finally came in mid-July, they came with violence that turned fields into mud and flattened plants. Thomas ran the numbers in early August and delivered the verdict. They would lose approximately 40% of their expected crop value. It was a disaster that pushed them from precarious to critical. The bank payments due in October couldn't be made without selling assets. Samuel called a meeting in the study on August 12th. Present were Thomas, William, Chester Havford, and Clara Ara, who'd been invited specifically at Samuel's insistence. We need capital, Samuel announced without preamble. $20,000 by October, or the First Bank of Richmond calls in our primary loan. If that happens, everything collapses. Havford spoke first. I've approached contacts about additional loans, but no one will extend credit without collateral. What about the workers? Thomas interrupted quietly. We have 37 people if we sold 10. Clara Ara's voice was ice. You're discussing selling human beings like livestock. In front of me, a woman you purchased like livestock. We're discussing survival. Samuel shot back. William stood abruptly, swaying slightly. This is wrong, all of it. We're corrupted by father's greed, by our own pride. We should confess everything. Throw ourselves on the mercy of the church. Let God sort it out. God isn't paying our bank loans, Samuel said coldly. Sit down, William. No. William's voice was louder now, slurred with drink and desperation. I'm done. I'm going to Richmond tomorrow. I'm going to tell the truth about Father's will, about the debt, about everything. Let it all burn. The room went silent. Samuel stood slowly. You'll destroy us, Samuel said quietly. We're already destroyed. Samuel crossed the room in 3 strides and hit his younger brother. It wasn't a slap, it was a punch thrown with full force, connecting with William's jaw and sending him sprawling backwards. Books tumbled down around him as he collapsed to the floor, blood flowing from his split lip. Samuel. Thomas moved between them, but Samuel shook him off. He doesn't get to destroy what I've worked to save. William touched his bleeding mouth, staring up at his brother. You've become father. You've become exactly what he was. Willing to sacrifice anything, anyone to protect the family name. Someone has to be willing to make hard choices. Clara's voice cut through the tension. There might be another option, one you haven't considered. All eyes turned to her. I've been thinking about our collective predicament. I believe I have a solution. She paused. Chester, you said no one will extend credit without collateral, but that's not quite accurate. No one will extend credit to the Rutledge brothers without collateral, but I'm not a Rutledge brother. I'm a woman with certain legal protections and a trust fund that was recently established. Havford leaned forward. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that I borrow money against my trust fund and my legal claim to part of the estate. I go to banks in Richmond, perhaps banks in North Carolina, where Martin Rutledge has connections. I present myself as a woman trying to secure her son's future. It's unconventional, but not impossible. Thomas was shaking his head. No bank would loan that kind of money to a woman. They might if I had a co-signer, someone with good credit, someone not connected to the Rutledge family debt, someone like Martin Rutledge, for instance. The implication landed like a stone. Samuel's eyes narrowed. You want to bring Martin back into this? I want to save this plantation because if it fails, my son and I lose everything too. Martin still believes there might be value here if properly managed. If I approach him, explain that I'm trying to protect Josiah's inheritance, ask for his helper's family, he might co-sign a loan, especially if we offer him 10% of future profits for 5 years. It was brilliant, and they all knew it. Clara Ara would assume debt, but the estate would get the capital it needed. Martin would get profitable return without risk, and the brothers would keep their plantation, at least temporarily. But it also meant giving Clara Ara even more power. Samuel studied her carefully. Why would you do this? What's in it for you? Clara Ara met his gaze steadily. I want your promise. All 3 of your promises witnessed and legally binding that when the debts are paid, when the estate is stable, you will grant me and Josiah complete freedom. Legal documents declaring us free persons with the trust fund intact and the West Wing property transferred to my ownership outright. I want an exit strategy, Samuel. I want to know that this nightmare has an end date, and if we refuse, then William goes to Richmond tomorrow and tells his truth. The banks call their loans, the plantation fails, and we all walk away with nothing. The brothers exchanged glances. Thomas finally spoke. We agree. No. Clara Ara's voice was firm. Daniel Thorne drafts the documents. Your family's attorney is too compromised. I want my attorney handling this with copies filed in 3 different choruses. Over the next 2 days, Clara traveled to Richmond with Daniel Thorne, met with Martin Rutledge, and presented her proposal. Martin, intrigued by profit without risk, agreed to co-sign the loan. By the end of August, Clara had secured $25,000. She returned to the plantation with bank drafts and a small, satisfied smile that suggested she understood exactly how much power she now held. The immediate crisis passed, but the balance of power had shifted fundamentally. Clara was no longer a purchased woman. She was a creditor, a business partner, the person who'd saved the plantation when the 3 brothers couldn't. Fall turned to winter, winter to spring. The 1856 tobacco crop was planted with hope born of desperation, but something else was happening that year. Political tensions between northern and southern states were escalating. Arguments about slavery, about states' rights, about the future of the nation were becoming impossible to ignore. William, who'd become increasingly withdrawn after Samuel's assault, spent hours listening to political discussions in Richmond taverns. He came home one evening in April and announced that war was coming, that it was inevitable. "Your religious crisis isn't our concern," Samuel said wearily. "We have actual problems." But William wouldn't let it drop. He started preaching to the workers in the evenings, holding prayer meetings in the tobacco barns, talking about redemption and judgment. Samuel ordered him to stop. William ignored the order. The conflict between the two brothers escalated throughout the spring. By June, they were barely speaking. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Henry County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Spring of 1857 brought decent weather and a promising tobacco crop. The brothers began to relax slightly. Thomas's projections showed that if the crops sold well, they could pay down significant debt by year's end. Then, on August 9, 1857, William Rutledge disappeared. He was last seen on the evening of August 8th, walking toward the tobacco barns after dinner. Ruth mentioned he'd seemed agitated, had been drinking heavily, had muttered something about redemption and truth. When he didn't appear for breakfast, Thomas went to his bedroom and found it empty, the bed not slept in, William's Bible missing. Samuel organized a search immediately. They found nothing. No signs of violence, no indications of where William might have gone. He'd simply vanished. On August 10th, a letter arrived from Richmond. It was addressed to Samuel in William's handwriting. Samuel read aloud, his voice flat. "Brother, by the time you read this, I will have done what should have been done 2 years ago. I've gone to the Richmond presbyter and confessed everything. Father's debt, Havford's manipulation, the arrangement with Clara, all of it. I've given them copies of financial documents I removed from Thomas's office. I've told them about purchasing a human being to satisfy a fraudulent will. I've exposed us, Samuel, because we deserve to be exposed. I'm leaving Virginia. Where? I won't say, but I'll spend the rest of my life seeking God's forgiveness. I pray you find your own redemption before it's too late. Your brother, William." Silence filled the study. Thomas had gone white. "He's destroyed us," Thomas whispered. The door burst open. Chester Havford stood there breathing heavily. In his hand was a newspaper. "You need to see this. Richmond Enquirer Morning Edition." He spread the newspaper on the desk. There on the third page, esteemed attorney Chester Haverford questioned in a state fraud allegation. Richmond Presbytery has referred questions to civil magistrate regarding claims made by Mr. William Rutledge of Henry County. Mr. Rutledge alleges systematic fraud in the administration of the Josiah Rutledge estate with accusations of forgery, embezzlement, and manipulation of testamentary documents. Investigation is ongoing. "How bad is this?" Samuel asked. Havford sank into a chair. "Bad. The magistrate is Cornelius Vaughn. He's meticulous, honest. If he starts pulling bank records, examining the will, we have maybe 2 weeks. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. Magistrate Vaughn interviewed everyone, the brothers, Clara, house servants, field workers, business associates. He examined the will with 3 handwriting experts. He subpoenaed bank records from 4 institutions. What he discovered was damning, but not quite what William had claimed. The will was genuine. Josiah's signature was real, witnessed properly, but the interpretation Havford had given was deliberately misleading. The clause about preserving the family line through unusual union wasn't meant as literal instruction. It was Josiah's bitter poetry, his way of saying his sons needed to work together rather than divide the property. Any competent attorney would have recognized it as symbolic language. But Havford had seen opportunity. He'd convinced 3 desperate brothers that their father demanded an impossible arrangement, then guided them through creating it. He'd used their compliance to justify enormous fees to drain an estate already drowning in debt. On October 3, 1857, Magistrate Vaughn issued his findings. Chester Havford was charged with fraud and embezzlement. He was disbarred, fined $12,000, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He died of apoplexy 18 months into his sentence. The Rutledge brothers were cleared of criminal wrongdoing. The magistrate found they'd been manipulated by their attorney. Clara's marriage to Samuel was legally valid, but the publicity destroyed them socially. Every prominent family in Virginia read about the investigation, about the purchased bride, about 3 brothers sharing 1 woman, about a 6-fingered heir and a fortune built on lies. Invitations stopped. Business partners withdrew. The Rutledge name became synonymous with scandal. Thomas handled it worst. learning that his careful management had been built on fraudulent foundations, broke something in him. He began drinking heavily, stopped keeping records. On a cold morning in January 1858, Ruth found him in his bedroom, dead from what the physician called heart failure, but everyone knew was despair. Samuel buried his brother and tried to continue, but the 1857 crop had been compromised by the investigation. Buyers didn't want tobacco associated with scandal. Prices fell. Debts mounted. By spring of 1858, Samuel knew it was over. He met with Clara Ara in the study one final evening in March. "The plantation will be auctioned to pay creditors," he said flatly. "Your trust fund should be protected, and your legal claim might net you $3,000 or $4,000 after the banks take their share." "I'm sorry. We tried." Clara looked at him across the desk. "Did you ever love her? Your mother?" The question caught Samuel off guard. "What?" "I'm trying to understand how a family gets here, how love becomes transaction. How children become chess pieces." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "My father loved my mother, I think. But when she died, something in him died too. He became obsessed with legacy, with permanence. He forgot that families are made of people, not property. And I became him. Exactly what William said." Samuel walked to the window. "I don't know where my younger brother went if he found peace, but he was right to run. This place is cursed by ambition and greed." The auction happened on April 20th, 1858. Everything went under the hammer: land, buildings, equipment, livestock, and 37 human beings who were sold to different buyers and scattered across Virginia. The house brought $12,000. The land brought less than expected. When banks and creditors were paid, Clara received $4,300 in legal ownership of furniture from the West Wing. Daniel Thorne had prepared documents that granted her and Josiah official freedom. Samuel took his share, barely $900, and disappeared. Some said he went west to California. Others claimed he drank himself to death in a Baltimore boarding house. No one knew for certain. Clara Ara left Virginia in May of 1858. She took 4-year-old Josiah, her $4,000, and Ruth, who she'd purchased freedom for, with $500 of her settlement. The three of them traveled to Philadelphia, where Clara Ara had corresponded with a Quaker community that helped former slaves establish new lives. She never married again. She opened a small shop selling fabrics and sewing supplies, and she raised Josiah to be nothing like his father, grandfather, or uncles. She taught him that the 6-fingered hand he'd been born with wasn't a mark of corruption, but simply a variation. Josiah grew up in Philadelphia, attended school, learned his mother's business. That extra finger gave him remarkable dexterity with small tools. He became an excellent jeweler, known for intricate work that others found impossible. He married a teacher from Boston, had 3 children, and never returned to Virginia. Clara lived to be 62 years old. In her final weeks, bedridden with pneumonia, she told Josiah the full story of where he came from. The auction house, the forced arrangement, the fraudulent will, all of it. She wanted him to know, she said, so he would understand what survival sometimes required. After her death in 1873, Josiah found her journal hidden in a locked box, 40 pages of careful handwriting documenting everything that had happened at the Rutledge plantation. Names, dates, financial details, personal observations. He burned the journal on the advice of his wife, who worried that such documentation could endanger their children if Virginia authorities decided to investigate old scandals. But before he burned it, Josiah copied one passage into his own diary, his mother's final entry, written in April 1858, as she prepared to leave Virginia. "They bought me to preserve their bloodline, to secure their inheritance, to save their family name. Instead, I survived them all. My son bears 6 fingers and no shame. We are free, and they are dust. History will forget the Rutledge brothers and their father's poisoned legacy, but I will remember. I will always remember what it cost to survive. Men who believed other human beings could be purchased and shaped to their will. The price of their ambition was paid in full, not by money, but by their own destruction." Let this be a lesson to anyone who reads these words. Some inheritances are curses, and some bloodlines deserve to end. The Rutledge plantation was eventually purchased by a consortium of Richmond merchants. They razed the main house in 1861, using the land for military purposes during the Civil War that William had predicted. After the war, the property changed hands several times, each owner finding that tobacco grown on that soil never quite thrived the way it had in the Rutledge years. By 1870, all traces of the Rutledge family had been erased from Henry County records, except for a few legal documents filed in courthouse basement, gathering dust alongside thousands of other forgotten family tragedies. This mystery shows us how greed, desperation, and the sins of fathers can destroy everything they touch. Three brothers thought they could secure their future by purchasing a human being and forcing her into an impossible arrangement. Instead, they lost everything: their fortune, their reputation, their lives. Clara Ara survived because she understood something the Rutledge men never did: that patience, intelligence, and the will to endure could be more powerful than any amount of money or social standing. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in those Virginia fields? Leave your comment below if you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.